story short, I had made a pretty sweet video about mounting these R6 forks on a Virago, and then my camera died. And then in the same week, my hard drive with the edit and a lot of my video died. I was able to recover a lot of the video, but almost all of the audio was all garbled up. But still, that recovered video is what you'll see in the first 2/3 of this video. So I did what I usually do and just quit everything at the first sign of hardship. But I had made a pretty sweet video where I measured the old Virago stem, figured out the geometry of the Virago head on the frame, measuring it and using some of the dimensions from the stem. I measured the new R6 stem and drew it all out. I went through some of my thoughts on what this new custom stem should look like, why it should look how it does. I ran a whole bunch of test cuts on test material to figure out optimal speeds and feeds on my lathe. I also used those cuts to make sure my bearing clearances were spot on, make sure the sizes that I'm sneaking up to are just right. I cut some test threads and verified that they were the same as the R6, made sure all the hardware fit. But then I moved shops, so I had to whip up some temporary spacers so that I could throw the bike back together so that it would roll and be easier to move. And then when I came back to this fork swap job a couple months later, I was looking at all my old notes and I realized I didn't think I need to make a custom stem. With this setup, I really just needed some spacers, and the old stem from the R6 seemed like it would work with barely any modification at all. So I took the front end apart from its temporary mounting and machined some spacers to mock up the bearings. I didn't want to be testing with the real bearings because they're a press fit, and the risk of hurting something pressing these bearings on and off over and over while I messed with these spacers was too much risk. So I used the spacers so that I could make some aluminum spacers, and I could use those to sneak up on the final dimensions that I needed, and it turns out it'll work. Everything mounted up perfectly with just a few small spacers using the new bearings that I wanted and only slightly modifying the old R6 stem. So with only a couple 100,000 spacers, the fit to the bottom of the frame was excellent, and the nut at the top of the stem with all the components in was perfectly flush to the stem, which is more or less how it is on the factory R6 install. So now that I knew that was going to work, I pressed the R6 stem out. I needed to turn a small protective piece out of aluminum so I wasn't pressing directly on the stem. And then with the stem pressed out, I could modify the lower bearing area on the stem to accept this new bearing. While machining this, I had worked up kind of plunging in at a taper with the compound rest and then feeding across, but it ended up being a lot easier or simpler to just orient the tool and use the land of the tool, the flat part that you don't usually cut with, to cut the nice taper that led into the bearing surface instead of fighting the compound rest and getting everything just right. So really in just one simple motion, you can turn a stem so that an R6 stem will work in a Virago like this in just modifying one surface. I had initially set this up to cut the taper I needed, and I must have had it a hair off because the land of the insert ended up being perfect to cut the same taper that was on there. And what I ended up with, this was right at 30 millimeters because the bearing, I guess, has to slide over. They don't want too much of a press. So I have this about 2/1000ths of an inch bigger, 1.5. So I'll get a nice firm press down here, but the bearing will still be able to slide over without doing too much damage there. And then I managed to get a nice taper, so I kept the taper there. Pretty sure this is going to work out really good. And before I press it in, I'm going to clean up the lower triple so that it's ready to go. I don't want to be grinding on it with bearing surfaces right next to it. right, I'm back on my assembly tea towel thing here. Anyway, so I want to assemble this now, and I want to lay everything out to make sure I do it right. So with tapered roller bearings, typically, almost always, they face each other. So the small parts face each other. So you've got a bearing that is tapered and another one, and usually they face each other like this. Wherever the assembly is, how far apart, doesn't matter. They need to be like that. So the bottom one needs to be like this, the top one needs to be like that. So the very first thing on this assembly is the spacer I made. This bearing will go like this. It should barely slide over that, which is fine. And then I will need to press it down onto this. This piece will go into the stem. I can use it to press the bearing, but I won't. And then after that, this piece will get pressed into the upper stem. This bearing will slide on and into that. So to press this bearing on, I don't want to press directly on the cage and hurt it. I had an old spacer laying around that I turned a lip onto, and it will allow me to press on this way, the race, which is a little stronger. And then I have this piece of tube. I can press on the top of that, press that bearing down onto there. I got the spacer in. That's the next step. Don't forget your seal, and don't forget to pack the bearing with grease. I definitely didn't forget off camera and have to press this on and back off. All right, I got a seal, I got a bearing, I got my spacer. Let's see how it fits. Both of these races are just barely a fit. And coincidentally, this spacer that I had made forever ago is the right size to be able to tap them in. Seems okay. This assembly will slide in, that bearing will seat, this bearing over the top, and then I'm going to use this nut and crank it down pretty good just to seat everything. Alright, I got the camera up close while I tighten this. Let's see if anything moves. There's bound to be a little bit left to seat the bearing. Oh yeah, I can feel it. Oh yeah, that took all the gap out of right there. Well, I must have been dead nuts on with my spacer measurement. I did it again. I forgot the seal. So before I tighten all this up, I need to pick a seal. This is the seal that came with the bearing, and it kind of like snaps on around the bearing. I like that. There's still a hair, a gap. This is meant to go inside of a taller stem. This is the seal that was on the R6, and it's much larger. Yeah, that's not as good. Okay, I'm gonna use the seal that comes with this bearing. So put the first nut on. All right, so I tightened everything down to pull the gap out to kind of, I guess, call it preload. Now what I'm gonna do is tighten this down. So what I'm gonna do is tighten this down until it's like obviously too tight. Oh yeah. So if it doesn't move at all on its own, it's way too tight. So I tighten it down, I got gap everywhere. So now I'm gonna loosen this guy just a hair. And it'll keep moving a little on its own. I want it a little looser. Some people set them so loose that when you leave it, it'll just fall over on its own. That seems a little loose for me. But there's no play. It's snug, it's nice and snug, but it still is nice and loose. It'll move on its own when I give it a light push. Then there's a rubber washer. The rubber washer lets the second nut tighten against the first nut without me having to tighten the first nut anymore. So I got the first nut perfect. I can get the second nut snug and then turn it until the castellations line up. without having to tighten or loosen that first nut anymore. So there's a little bit of preload between the two nuts, which will help it from anything from coming loose. And then there's also this washer that goes in those castellations that keeps either of them from spinning. And finally, the upper triple, it gets a washer and it gets a nut. And I'm gonna leave this nut loose until I get the fork tube slid in here in a second. But really, I'm really happy with this. There's almost no gap down here. I probably could have made the spacer a little thicker, but it is what it is now. And on the standard bike, so at least on the R6 I had before, when this is fully torqued, the top of the nut and the top of the stem are perfectly in line. And I'm gonna get that, when I take that up to 60 foot-pounds, which I think is its torque spec, I'll look it up, then I'm gonna be set. So I'm gonna leave this a little loose, slide these forks in, tighten everything down, and this will be done. This torque down and we'll be set. Ooh, and that is perfectly flush. Oh, it's perfectly flush. It's exactly what I wanted. Cool, we did it. You may have noticed this gap here in the top triple, weirdly normal. So there's usually a bit of a gap on an R6. This top bit is a little longer to kind of cover it, but not really. There's actually a pretty decent gap in there, even on an R6, so that's just how it is. If I'd have made this stem, I probably would have made that gap a little shorter, but you need some room for the threads for the two castle nuts. And boy, did I get that gap close. That's almost too close. If that becomes a problem, I think when I take this apart for paint, I might grind just a fuzz off of there. That's very close. In my disheartened delay on the bike, I got my old station wagon out and got it going again. I'll have a video on that soon, check that out. But now I'm back on the bike. I got my list. It's pretty daunting, but I'm gonna try and get this done and ride it still this summer. I really only have a few videos, but I've noticed people keep subscribing, so thank you very much to everyone who's subscribing, and I hope you enjoyed this video.